Chapter 8. The Slough of Despond. After the first few days, things didn't seem quite so bad. The blow had fallen. It was automatic to pick up courage and go on. The apples on their gnarled apple trees were red. "Let's get those apples picked," Emily suggested. "I'll make some into apple butter, colored with elderberries, like I did last year." It was good, Grandpa Webster remembered. They raked and burned the falling leaves, talking sociably. "Hunting season must be on," said Emily, hearing a shot in the slough. "There didn't used to be any hunting season," her grandfather chuckled. "We used to take a dog and go out whenever we liked." "Aunt Sophie will be asking us over for dinner," remarked Emily. Uncle Chester was a hunter, and a wild duck dinner was an annual family event. Her grandfather brushed away a flying piece of soot and smiled at her across the fire. "It's certainly nice to have you home, Emmy. You're not going to be lonesome, are you?" "Of course not," she lied. They set the hard coal heater up in the parlor. September was still golden sweet, but the mornings and evenings were cool. The heater kept the downstairs stuffily warm. Her grandfather and Judge Hodges played chess there. Emily saw children going past to school, carrying books, lagging and laughing, and she envied them. Ugh, to be going back to school. "But I'm not, and that's that," she told herself sternly. "Grandpa, I'm going out and wash storm windows." "All right, Emily, you're certainly a go-ahead," he said. Letters and cards had begun to come back from the departed ones. Emily answered them the same day they arrived. Mabel wrote, describing the big college on the Hudson. A letter from Ellen told of Hunter's opening achievements at Carleton. There were letters from Nell and Gladys and Annette. Annette was being rushed by several sororities. "The fraternities are putting up a battle for Don, too," she wrote. "He hasn't decided which one he's going to join." There was no letter from Don. Somehow, after those summer calls, Emily had really expected one, and it hurt that he didn't write. She read in the paper that Woodrow Wilson, the scholarly Democratic nominee for the presidency, had addressed the university. Don knew how interested she would be in this event, but he didn't write. An attempt was made on the life of Theodore Roosevelt. The three-cornered campaign was putting on frantic speed. She longed to talk it over with someone, but her grandfather always branched off into a discussion of Abraham Lincoln. "Don might write. He might," she thought, holding back tears as she bundled the newspapers out of the way with furious energy. Depression settled down upon her, and although she tried to brush it away, it thickened like a fog. "Why, the kids will be home for Thanksgiving. That will be here in no time. I mustn't get this way," she thought. But she felt lonely and deserted and futile. "A mood like this has to be fought. It's like an enemy with a gun," she told herself. But she couldn't seem to find a gun with which to fight. One day at dinner her grandfather had a story about Khalil. He had been bitten by a snake. "Just a harmless water snake. I was nearby and saw the critter, but Khalil hit the sky. While I washed him off and put iodine, he was wagging his hands and describing the snake to Yusuf. You'd have thought it was a prehistoric monster." He chuckled, but Emily didn't smile. She had stopped listening after he said the snake was harmless. Her grandfather's tone changed. I believe you're lonesome, Emmy. Why, of course not, she answered hastily. How's Khalil now? Pretty well, but he runs into trouble in school. It's his English, he thinks. The boys tease him. It's a good thing there's a big group from Little Syria. They're company for each other, Emily answered listlessly. Her grandfather studied her from under his bushy brows. Emmy, he said, maybe you'd like to take music lessons again. He loved music, and she hadn't touched the piano since the crowd went away. Perhaps later, she evaded. She wasn't in a mood for music, somehow. I'm planning to do a lot of reading this winter. Maybe you'd read out loud to me like you did when I was sick, he suggested hopefully. You remember how we liked Kenilworth, and you said we were going on to the Talisman, but we never did. That's a good idea. We'll have to do it. But she put it off. The books she longed for weren't the old-fashioned novels in the glass-enclosed shelves of the secretary. They were the books her friends at college would be reading under Richard Burton and Maria Sanford and the other famous professors whose names she knew, or the works on sociology she would have liked to study for Jane Addams' sake. She did bring home books from the library in armloads, replenishing them every 2 or 3 days. She read avidly, indiscriminately, using them as an antidote for the pain in her heart. But they didn't help much. There was no one to talk them over with. They were almost as useless as the newspapers. I know what I'll do, she decided. I'll go up to the high school. We had such fun that day we went before. But the visit was not a success. It was not at all like the merry expedition with the girls. The seniors were chattering about class pins and caps. The Philomathians and the Zetamathians were having their annual fight for members. And none of it concerned Emily any more, not even the debating club. Wakeman will be good, I think, said Jerry Sibley. You know he's coaching football too, like Stewie. I've been elected cheerleader, he added, grinning. You have? She was surprised. Jerry didn't seem the type, somehow. I'm too small for football, but Wake said he wanted to put me to work, Jerry replied. Come out to a game sometime. See what a good comedian I am. I will. After that, when the team was playing at home, she went to the games, walking alone down Front Street and out to the athletic field, joining, but never being part of, the cheering crowd around the sidelines. Jerry had developed into a comedian indeed. He brought a student's zeal to the business of leading the calls and cheers. His glasses laid aside, he jumped and leaped and even turned somersaults. He's marvelous. He's wonderful. He's as good as Rathbun up at the U, Emily heard the girls sing. That was a good idea of Mr. Wakeman's, she thought, observing the pride on Jerry's gleaming face when he ran off the field. It was good for Jerry to be in a place of importance. He had been too much the student in the shadow of his handsome older brother. How had Mr. Wakeman known? She looked with interest at the big new coach. After the games, the high school boys and girls drifted down Front Street into the drugstores and Heinz's ice cream parlor. Emily went into Heinz's. The big mirrored room was jammed with rooters, yelling and screaming, rushing from table to table. This is childish. I'll never come again, she thought. But after the next game she drifted in, a wistful, lonely figure. No one except her was alone. Oh well, she consoled herself. Thanksgiving will soon be here, and I'll have some friends again. She didn't let herself think how swiftly the brief vacation would fly. October had turned the world into a bowl of brightness. The distant hills were clothed with colored trees. The locust tree was yellow among red and golden and russet companions, and down in the slough boys jumped from hummock to hummock, gathering cattails. The slough was still teeming with ducks. She and her grandfather were invited to the expected dinner, duck with apple dressing, baked by Minnie to a queen's taste. Aunt Sophie was full of news of Annette. She had been rushed by 5 sororities and had joined the Epsilon Iotas. Dawn sent her the most beautiful corsage bouquet when she pledged. Has Don pledged? Certainly. Didn't you know? He's joined the Sigma Thetas. I think that's the name. I can't help mixing them up, and it makes Annette furious, Aunt Sophie said, wrinkling her brow. He might have written, Emily thought. In her room that night she took up the volume of Browning. She kept it on her bureau, and never saw its brown and gold cover without a quiver of her heart. She turned the pages, trying to bring back some of last summer's happy intimacy. It was like a dream now that he had ever come, that they had talked and joked and eaten cookies, watching the marsh hens with their babies. He's forgotten I ever existed. I'd better forget about him, she declared aloud. There was wind and rain, and the leaves fell faster. Soon almost all the trees were bald. Wilson, the professor, was elected president. Dejectedly, Emily took off her bull moose pin. It grew colder, and the vines and flowers froze. The last migrating birds hurried away. The little shore birds she had loved to watch were gone. The frogs and snakes were hibernating. Winter was hovering, ready to pounce. The heater kept the downstairs cozy. The 2 old chess players reveled in its warmth. But the upstairs, heated only through registers in the floor, was cold. Emily's room was too cold to read in, but it didn't matter. Her grandfather went to bed right after supper, and the parlor then was hers alone. Drawing her favorite stenciled rocker close to the lamp, she worked on her high school memory book. She lingered over every page, the programs of Philomathian rhetoricals, the announcements of debates, the place cards of parties with the girls. She unscrewed her graduation fountain pen and wrote countless letters. She wrote more letters than she received. They certainly are slow in answering, she thought, beginning a letter to Nell, who already owed her a letter. But then, she admitted to herself, they're not living in my life the way I'm living in theirs. That was exactly what she was doing, she realized. It was wrong, but what else was she to do? She bent her head to her arms in real despair. What did the future hold for her, she thought. Not marriage and a family, for she was not attractive to boys. Not getting a letter from Don had settled that. If she were to have a career, she should be preparing for it now. She thought of Jane Addams going through Rockford Seminary and on to her rewarding travels. Grandpa will die someday, and then what will I do? She was 18. That should be such a wonderful time, and she was doing nothing. Life was passing without love or work. Tears began to flow, and she jumped up, crumbling the letter. She walked to the window and looked out. The sky was covered with low-hanging clouds, but she could see the slough, frozen into a sea of hard brown billows. Except for a line of untidy muskrat houses, there wasn't a sign of life in that desolate place. It isn't my slough, it's a slough of despond, she thought bitterly. Oh, what shall I do? What shall I do? In the morning it was snowing. A slow stream of flakes was dripping past her window, and the slough was covered with a thin white film through which dead rushes, quills, and cattails poked. She felt heavy and lifeless, and her mind reached out despairingly for something to fill the day. There's the St. John's game. St. John was Deep Valley's traditional rival. I'll go to that. And there's a pep rally up at the high school this morning. Her grandfather was standing at the kitchen door throwing out crumbs. He always fed the loyal blue jays, nuthatches, and chickadees, which stayed the winter. He looked around with a timid half smile on his face, and she knew he wanted to discover whether her dark mood still held. The look cut her. "Good morning, Grandpa," she said, trying to make her tone cheerful. "I'm going up to the high school. There's a football rally this morning." "Good. It will do you good," he said, and after breakfast, when she was finishing the morning work, he approached her. "Emmy, I've been kind of worried about you. All your friends are gone away. Maybe you ought to go, too." Her eyes blurred. "Why, that's ridiculous," she said. "I wouldn't leave you for the world. Besides, I like it here. I just love Deep Valley." "Do you?" The old eyes looked anxious. "Really?" "Of course." She'd have to do better, or he would see how she felt, thought Emily, as she put on her heavy coat, buckled her overshoes, and tied a scarf over last year's round felt hat. The snow was still coming down, soft as feathers, brushing her cheek. She had always loved the first snow, but today it made her unhappy, and she entered the high school uneasily. The rally was open to the public, of course, but very few people, except students, attended. The teachers all greeted her kindly, but there was something disturbing in Miss Fowler's manner. Pity or disappointment, Emily didn't know exactly what. She went into the crowded assembly room and took the only vacant seat, which happened to be up front. The team sat on the platform, and the meeting opened with the school song. Jerry led the crowd through a few preliminary cheers, and Miss Bangeter made a speech. It wasn't a very good speech. Miss Bangeter didn't really consider football important, although she tried to, and everyone understood. Then Wake was introduced, and a roar of affectionate approval rose. Plainly, the school liked the big, casual young man who stood smiling on the platform. But Mr. Wakeman's speech wasn't right, either, although he had a most engaging manner and a likable Southern voice. He didn't say the right things. He knew football, but he didn't really understand about the rivalry between Deep Valley and St. John. He didn't know how long it had lasted, nor how deep it went. Emily could see that Jerry wasn't satisfied. His eyes, behind the big glasses, kept roving over the room. He evidently found the help he was seeking, for when Mr. Wakeman ended, Jerry sprang to his feet. "We have a distinguished visitor here today, someone who can tell us about the last 4 games with St. John. I want to introduce a star debater from the class of 1912 and a great Deep Valley football fan, Emily Webster." Emily was astounded and acutely embarrassed, but Jerry started last year's cheer. "There's Walker, King, and Webster, and they can talk a few." The school caught it up, and it did sound wonderful, laden as it was with the memories of previous triumphs and of Dawn. Urged forward by cheers and clapping, she got to the platform, and she was never embarrassed there. When she began to speak, all her debating skill came back. She described the long rivalry amusingly, calling the teams Minnesota's, Hatfield's, and McCoy's. She told dramatic anecdotes from games of other years. She pointed up the times Deep Valley had won to prove what the team would do today, and she made the times Deep Valley had lost supply as strong a motive for winning. She worked up such enthusiasm that Jerry had to end the applause by calling for the school song again. The team marched off the stage, but he motioned for Emily to stay, saying eagerly, "I want you to meet Wake." Flushed and smiling shyly, she found herself shaking Mr. Wakeman's hand. The young coach was regarding her with friendly, observant brown eyes. "That was a wonderful speech, Miss Emily." "Thank you. It's lucky for us you were here today. I've heard about you from Stewie." "You had?" "He thought very highly of your debating. In fact," he added, "everyone around here does. I've heard so much about Emily Webster that I've been wanting to meet you." He smiled. "The joke is that I've seen you a number of times, but I thought you were a high school girl. It was the hair ribbon, I reckon. Well, you're still a high school girl at heart." His tone was laughing. The remark was innocent, but suddenly all Emily's happiness in her triumph fell away. She wasn't still a high school girl, and she couldn't keep on pretending to be one forever. She didn't belong here. She was a ghost. She went soberly down the stairs and out into the snow. The more she thought about Mr. Wakeman's statement, the clearer the pattern of her behavior grew. Humiliation choked her. Anger rose, a furious anger at herself, and she walked faster. "I was wondering last night what I could do. Well, there's one thing I can do, and I'll do it as soon as I get home. I can put up my hair."